Nathan Hale, a cold-hearted businessman, a man who doesn't believe in love, marries the maid Lena solely to get revenge on his unfaithful fiancée. But he never expected the girl he saw as a pawn to bear a familiar scar, a memory long forgotten. It was the beginning of a game of fate where the heart cannot be deceived. Nathan Hale had never believed in love. To him, love was a luxury that the weak clung to, a desperate attempt to fill the void in their souls. And marriage? A deal, a contract, a means to consolidate power, nothing more. So when Celeste Morgan, the woman the entire elite circle believed would become his wife, ran off just 3 days before the wedding, it wasn't Nathan's heart that was wounded. It was his ego, his honor, the thinly veiled contempt in the eyes of those who once envied him, now snickering behind his back. And Celeste, she didn't just walk away. She ran off with another man, hand in hand, openly, shamelessly. She even left a final message. "Nathan, you have everything except a heart. I don't want to be the bride of a machine." Nathan read the message once, then deleted it. Not a single frown crossed his face. He didn't get angry. He didn't smash anything. He didn't call her to demand an explanation. Instead, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood silently by the penthouse window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes like shards of broken glass. If Celeste wanted to play a game, then he would be the one to set the rules. The next day, the press exploded. Nathan Hale announces engagement to the nameless maid Lena Brooks. The headline struck like lightning in a clear sky. But it was true. Lena, the girl with dark brown hair and eyes so clear they seemed untouched by deceit, sat frozen on an old wooden chair in the storage room when the butler summoned her to Nathan's office. She didn't understand. She didn't dare believe it, and when he looked at her with those cold eyes appraising her like an object rather than a person, Lena could only clutch the hem of her dress to keep from trembling. "If you agree," he said, his voice steady as honed steel, "you'll never want for anything in your life again. You'll have my name, my wealth, my power. But don't be mistaken." His gaze sharpened suddenly. "I don't love you, and I don't need you to love me." "Then why me?" Lena's voice came out hoarse, dissolving into the thick, oppressive air. Nathan paused for a beat. Then he stepped closer, leaning down to whisper, "Because you're the one she despised the most, and nothing will drive Celeste crazier than me marrying you." Lena didn't know why she nodded. Maybe it was Nathan's eyes, empty yet deep as a dark abyss, that made it impossible for her to turn away. Maybe it was the exhaustion in her heart, a lifetime that had never offered her a better choice. Or maybe, just maybe, a part of her was curious. Why would a man who stood at the pinnacle of the world choose her, the most invisible person in this house, to be his wife? 3 days later they were married. No flowers, no gentle music, no love, only the stunned gazes of the guests, and a wedding dress that Lena wore like she was draping herself in a fate she couldn't comprehend. Celeste was at the wedding. Her expression was haughty, her red-painted lips curled into a mocking smile, but something twisted in her eyes, as if she couldn't believe Nathan had actually gone through with it. Nathan didn't touch Lena's hand until the priest signaled him to, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch brushed her skin like ice grazing fire. "The game has begun, Celeste," his eyes seemed to say. And Lena? She could only stare straight ahead, swallowing the panic rising in her throat. She had just become the wife of a man whose heart she could never reach, and who might just be the most dangerous person she'd ever met. The pristine white wedding dress Lena wore that day carried no bride's dreams. It was merely a beautiful fabric masking a brutal truth. Today, she wasn't marrying a man out of love. She was signing an indefinite sentence with her own heart. The guests buzzed with chatter, the shimmering lights flooding the wedding hall as if trying to obscure the icy reality unfolding. Lena stepped into the aisle, each footfall treading on the whispers of high society. Who is she? A maid? Seriously? What the hell is Nathan thinking? She didn't dare lift her face. She knew full well. Their gazes were like a barrage of needles, tearing apart the fragile patches of self-respect she'd tried to stitch together. And him? Nathan stood there, clad in a black suit so impeccable it seemed carved by the blade of perfection itself. His eyes were a frozen lake, not a ripple of emotion, not a trace of a smile. As Lena approached, he didn't offer his hand, didn't speak, only gave a slight nod, as if confirming that the delivery had arrived. The wedding proceeded like a corporate signing when the priest asked, "Nathan Hale, do you take Lena Brooks to be your wife?" He answered immediately, without hesitation, without feeling, yes. When it was Lena's turn, her voice trembled faintly. "Yes." The rings were exchanged. A bride's kiss, non-existent. Nathan only gave her hand a brief squeeze, more like a full stop than a beginning. Amid the opulent crowd, Celeste Morgan's gaze cut like a sharpened blade. She sat in the front row, her dress so dazzling it was almost blinding, her crimson lips curved like a thorny rose. As Nathan and Lena descended from the altar, Celeste clapped, slowly, venomously, as if applauding the curtain fall of a deeply ironic play. "Such a lovely couple," she murmured as she brushed past Lena, her eyes not on her but on Nathan. Those words sliced into Lena deeper than any stare ever could. When they returned to the Hale mansion, Lena assumed she'd be given a separate room. She never expected Nathan to lead her straight to the master bedroom, where he slept. Her heart pounded as the door closed behind them. "My room," he said. His voice wasn't cold. It was hollow, as if emotion had been wrung dry long ago. Can I sleep in another room?" Lena ventured, trying to stay calm. Nathan turned, his gaze drifting toward the window where moonlight had just spilled into the room. Then he stepped closer, his breath grazing her ear as he whispered, "Celeste is watching." Lena froze. It took her a few seconds to understand. This wasn't a wedding night. This was a performance, and she was an actor on this bed. "Don't overthink it," Nathan said, sitting down in a chair, removing his watch, his eyes never once settling on her. "You just need to play your part well. Everything else, I'll handle." Lena stood motionless in the vast room as if turned to stone. The clock ticked. Neither spoke another word. And then she realized this room wasn't cold because of the temperature, but because the man sitting in it had never learned how to warm anyone's heart. The first night passed in silence, as if the room and the people within it were sealed in frost. Lena lay with her back to Nathan, her body rigid, her breathing shallow and halting as she tried not to make a sound. Nathan sat on the long chair near the window, one hand draped over his knee, his gaze lost in the darkness outside, where only moonlight and the sigh of the wind through the trees existed. He couldn't sleep, not because the chair was hard, but because something felt off. A long while later, when the room was filled only with the ticking of the clock and Lena's faint breaths, she shifted. The blanket slipped slightly from her shoulder, revealing a patch of pale skin and a scar. Nathan hadn't meant to look, but the light from the bedside lamp caught it just then, enough for him to see. A thin scar, curved like the slice of a blade, slanting across her left shoulder blade. It wasn't large, but it was strangely familiar, like a broken bone from the past. Suddenly unearthed, Nathan's heart tightened. He closed his eyes, but in that moment, a door in his mind swung open, violently, without warning. A river, icy water cutting through skin, a boy thrashing in the whirlpool, panicked, choking, white foam swirling around him, and then a girl, diving in, fragile, trembling, but her arms clamped around his shoulders like a lifeline. When he came to, he saw that girl sitting beside him, drenched, lips blue, and blood seeping from her left shoulder. It was that scar. Nathan opened his eyes, sweat beading on his forehead, though the room's temperature hadn't changed. He looked at Lena. She had turned her back again, unconsciously pulling the blanket to cover her shoulder, oblivious to the storm she'd just awakened in his dormant mind. The next morning, Nathan watched Lena in silence. She wasn't unlike the countless servants he'd passed by in his life, until he noticed the small silver necklace around her neck, a simple, worn, circular pendant. And in a fleeting moment, as Lena hesitated while pouring tea, her fingers brushed the necklace in an unconscious habit, twirling it between them as if seeking calm. Nathan froze. That girl from years ago had a necklace like that. She had the same habit whenever she was afraid. That afternoon, Lena went to the back garden, slipping off her shoes and walking barefoot on the lush green grass. The breeze blew gently, lifting her hair, her eyes half closed as if listening to a sound only she could hear. Nathan stood on the second-floor balcony, looking down. An indescribable feeling swelled in his chest, like someone whispering, "It's her." But how could it be? He remembered how that girl used to smile and say, "Going barefoot makes me feel freer than any pair of shoes ever could." Nathan began to notice himself watching Lena more than necessary. He didn't like it. It made him feel out of control, something he'd never let slip from his grasp. But the more he watched, the more pieces of memory fell into place. The scar, the necklace, bare feet on grass, damp hair, a gentleness so profound it made you forget she'd ever been hurt, and a question repeated in his mind like a silent refrain. Could it be her? Nathan wasn't sure, but from that moment, Lena was no longer just a pawn. She became the greatest mystery he'd ever encountered, and he knew he wouldn't be able to take his eyes off her until he uncovered the truth. From the moment he saw that scar, Nathan Hale no longer saw Lena Brooks the same way. Before, she had been a tool, a pawn placed precisely to wound the woman who betrayed him. But now, Lena was like a door leading to a fragment of memory Nathan thought he'd left behind long ago. And as that door creaked open, every tiny detail began to speak. The next morning, at breakfast in the ground-floor dining room, Lena sat quietly across from Nathan. She never spoke much. Head bowed as she ate, hands neatly placed on the table. But when Nathan casually mentioned the Willoughby River in an offhand story, Lena froze. Just for a split second, long enough for Nathan to notice her chopsticks pause mid-air, her eyes flickering with something strange. Surprise? Fear? Or memory? "You don't like water?" he asked, his voice light as a breeze brushing past a wine glass. Lena pressed her lips together, then shook her head. "No, I don't like swimming. I'm not very good at it." Nathan said nothing. But something tightened inside him. That girl from years ago had leapt into a raging river to save him from drowning and had nearly been swept away herself. If it was her, a fear of water would be inevitable. That afternoon, he deliberately dropped a glass in the study. The sound of shattering crystal rang out like a flash of lightning in a clear sky. Lena, passing by, flinched. Her reaction wasn't unusual, except for the way her hand instinctively clutched her left shoulder, right where the scar was. Just like that girl years ago who had tried to hide her pain so Nathan wouldn't worry. He stood still, his heart pounded in his chest. Everything fit, too perfectly to be coincidence. That evening, he sat in his office, the desk lamp casting light on his sharp features. On the table was a candid photo of Lena walking barefoot on the grass, her silver necklace glinting, her eyes dreamy, as if lost in another world. Nathan twirled the pen in his hand. Memories flooded back like the river he'd nearly drowned in all those years ago. That girl also wore a silver necklace with a small engraved pendant, also loved going barefoot, also had a way of being silent that made it impossible not to notice her. The next day, Lena brought tea to his room as usual. As she set the cup down, Nathan suddenly asked, "That necklace of yours, who gave it to you?" Lena hesitated. Her hand brushed the pendant like a reflex. "I don't remember," she said softly. "I've had it since I was little. Someone gave it to me after I had an accident by a river, but I don't recall their face, just a promise." Her voice was faint as a breeze, her eyes suddenly distant. Nathan held his breath. "What promise?" Lena shook her head. "Just A boy said that if I saved him, he'd marry me when we grew up. Childish stuff, I've forgotten most of it. Nathan felt the world tilt slightly. That night, he didn't sleep. He just sat there, silently watching the woman lying with her back to him, that small frame that had once held back a raging current to keep a strange boy alive. And now, that woman lay beside him, bearing the Hale name, yet remembering nothing of him. There was no doubt left. She was that girl from years ago. She was the only one who'd ever saved his life, and the only one he'd ever promised to marry. A promise that seemed childish had become an unforeseen fate. But one thing gnawed at Nathan. Why didn't she remember him? Why had that memory been buried in darkness? He knew he couldn't ask yet, couldn't force her to recall, because what he needed now wasn't just confirmation. It was the reason, the whole truth, and if Lena was the door to his past, then he was ready to step through. Whether what lay beyond was pain or a love long forgotten. The night breeze slipped through the slightly open window, stirring the thin white curtains like a breath from a past that had just returned. Nathan stood by the window frame, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside, but his mind was elsewhere. A river, a childish promise, an innocent pair of eyes that had once looked at him with all the courage and tenderness in the world. Behind him, Lena was brushing her hair. Each movement was gentle, silent, as if she were a familiar shadow that had never truly belonged to this place. He had stayed quiet for too long. There had been too many clues, too many truths aligning, too many echoes of memory, and tonight he could no longer bear the ambiguity. "Lena," he called, his voice low and soft, as if summoning a piece of his own soul. She turned, surprised. "Yes?" He approached slowly, stopping just an arm's length away. The room sank into a stillness so deep that even heartbeats seemed audible. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, his blue eyes for the first time not cold, but deep and weary. Lena blinked. I've never thought about it." "What about memories?" He tilted his head slightly. "Are there things you once remembered, then forgot?" She froze, her hand instinctively brushing the silver pendant. The question wasn't just a question. It was like a spell, stirring a distant corner of her mind, a place where dust-covered memories waited, unnamed. Nathan saw it. He took a deep breath. "Lena, have you ever thought that we might have met before?" Lena gave a faint smile, thinking he was joking, but the look in Nathan's eyes didn't allow her to hold on to that thought. Her smile faded. "We?" Her voice was soft as a passing breeze. "We've met," Nathan said, taking another step forward, his gaze fixed on her left shoulder, where the scar hid beneath the thin fabric. "By a river. You jumped in to save a boy from drowning. You got hurt. Right here." He raised his hand, brushing lightly against her shoulder. Right at that spot, Lena stood rooted to the ground. Her breath caught. The world around her seemed to vanish, leaving only the thundering pulse in her chest. "No." She stepped back, clutching her shoulder. How do you know?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. He only said one thing. "Because that boy was me." Time shattered, blur of images like fragments of a broken mirror in Lena's mind suddenly pieced themselves together. She saw the freezing river, a boy thrashing in the rushing current. She heard the screams, felt the bone-chilling cold cutting through her skin. A hand grasping hers. She pulled with all her strength. Then blood, then a promise. "When we grow up, I'll marry you." That voice, those eyes. It was Nathan. Lena gripped the pendant tightly, as if trying to hold onto the flood of memories rushing back. She stumbled backward, her hand covering her mouth. "No, it can't be." Nathan stepped forward, but didn't touch her. He knew Lena was battling her own memories, and some battles could only be won alone. "You don't remember because you were hurt back then, lost a lot of blood. I went back to find you, but you were gone." His voice broke, not cold anymore, but warm. "And real." I looked for you for years, but I never imagined you'd come back like this. Lena sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands cradling her head. Her heart was a storm. How could she have forgotten something so monumental? How could she have lived day after day with the man she'd saved, without knowing? And why had fate brought them back together, through a sham marriage, devoid of feeling, born of vengeance? She looked up at Nathan. The man she'd once thought was ice, reason, and heartlessness was now gazing at her as if afraid of losing something intangible, yet priceless. "If you've remembered," he said softly, "then now, I only want to know one thing. Do you regret saving me?" That question wasn't just a belated thank you. It was an invitation to step beyond the past, to a place where they could start anew, this time for each other, not for anyone else. Lena went still. She didn't answer, but in her eyes now there was no more fear, only the overwhelming relief of a truth reclaimed after so many years, lost. Ever since the night Lena remembered everything in that room, something had shifted. It wasn't obvious, wasn't loud, didn't need acknowledgement, but it was there, subtle like the scent of midnight flowers, quietly spreading. Nathan was still Nathan, still walking with that cold demeanor as if the world couldn't touch him. But with Lena, he was different, very different. The next morning when Lena woke up, a steaming cup of tea was already waiting on the table, her favorite kind, faintly scented with lavender. No one said anything. No note, but she knew. It was him. Once, at a party they attended together, amid a crowd of strangers and noise, Nathan kept his hand lightly on her back, like an invisible barrier between her and the world. The touch wasn't forceful, wasn't imposing, but Lena felt an unfamiliar sense of safety. What unsettled her most wasn't this sudden tenderness. It was that her heart was starting to respond. She began watching Nathan when he wasn't looking, noticing how he rolled up his sleeves, how he furrowed his brow when deep in thought, and even how he set his spoon beside his coffee cup, always at the same angle, always with one sugar cube left untouched. Nathan had strange habits, and now they made her want to understand him more. One time, in the library, Lena was standing on a chair to reach an old book on a high shelf. The chair wobbled, she lost her balance, and then a pair of arms wrapped around her waist from behind. She fell into him. Her heart raced. So close. Nathan didn't say anything. He held her for a few seconds longer, then let go, stepping back. "Careful," he said softly, but his voice wasn't emotionless anymore. It was warm, faint, like a flickering flame in the depths of winter. Lena started to fear the silences between them. Not because they were awkward, but because they were becoming so comfortable she didn't want to break them. One evening they sat together on the balcony. The city below glowed like thousands of wayward stars. For a long while neither spoke. There was only the wind and a silence that felt at ease. Then Nathan spoke quietly. "Have you ever thought we could have met in a different way?" Lena turned, catching his gaze. In those once icy eyes there was now something softer, hazier, like mist over a mirror. "Maybe," she whispered, "but if we had, would you still be you and would I still be me?" They both laughed, light as the breeze, thin as silk, but real. Lena still tried to keep her distance, still told herself it was all just the aftershock of an old promise. But every time Nathan passed by, every time he rested his hand on her shoulder as he entered the room, every time their eyes met by chance, her heart betrayed her reason. She no longer found him frightening. She no longer thought him cold. And worst of all, she began to want him to look at her with that gaze, the one that made it seem she was the only thing keeping him from falling into darkness. And Nathan? He didn't push. Didn't demand, didn't say he remembered. He simply gave her time, as if he understood that what bloomed on its own would be more beautiful than something forced from a tender bud. Every time Lena walked by, his heart beat out that familiar rhythm from years ago. "When we grow up, I'll marry you." This time, he had married her for real. But would she stay? Not for the past, but for the present. That morning a light rain fell. Raindrops clung to the railing like thousands of memories dripping from a nameless sky. Lena stood quietly by the window, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the glass fogged by her breath. For days now, her heart no longer beat to its old rhythm. Everything within her was slowly changing, not because of the promise from years ago, nor because of memories, but because of Nathan, the man before her who was no longer the man she once thought he was. He wasn't as cold as his exterior suggested. He was just too accustomed to not being loved. She had planned to wait for him to speak first, wait for something clear, a sign, a perfect moment, but then she realized, sometimes love doesn't need a reason, doesn't need rules, it just needs courage. When Lena found Nathan, he was standing on the balcony, his back to her. The early light pierced through the rain, casting a faint glow over him, making the man appear both strong and solitary. Lena approached. Each step was slow, as if she were crossing the threshold of her own fears. He turned when he heard her, slightly surprised that she had sought him out. "You didn't bring a coat," he said softly. "It's cold out here." "It's not as cold as keeping inside the things that should be said," she replied, her eyes never leaving his. Nathan fell silent. His gaze held hers, as if waiting, or perhaps dreading, what he was about to hear. Lena took a deep breath. "I used to think I was here only because of the past, because of a promise I didn't remember, because of a marriage that didn't start with love." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes shone brighter than ever. "But now, I know I'm not staying because of anything that happened before." She took another step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm staying because of you." A pause, then a whisper. "Because I love you." The world seemed to stop turning. Every sound was swallowed in that moment, leaving only the faint patter of rain and Nathan's eyes slowly melting. He didn't believe in fate, never had, but in that moment he did. He believed that no matter how many turns life took, no matter how many memories time erased, this girl would still find her way back to him. Nathan grasped her hand, saying nothing at first. He looked at her as if he'd been waiting for so long to see this look, to hear these words from the very girl who had once saved his life with her small hands all those years ago. "Say it again," he said, his voice hoarse. "One more time." Lena smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears but sparkling. "I love you, Nathan." This time, he didn't wait a second longer. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly that Lena could hear his heart beating, fast, strong, as if it had never known any rhythm but her. On that rain-draped balcony, two people who had once been strangers, who had met like fate, parted like irony, and reunited like an unfulfilled promise, finally stood side by side for a love that was real, not for revenge, not for duty, not for memories, just because they chose each other, and this time they wouldn't let each other slip away again.